Download this audiobook in high-quality MP3 format at MindShelf.net.
Preface: The hunger that never says thank you. When was the last time you felt like you had enough? Not enough for now, with the asterisk already forming in your mind about what still needs to happen next. Not enough compared to where you used to be, with the quiet awareness that the comparison only works looking backward. But enough, full stop. Enough money, enough success, enough recognition, enough of the things you have spent years pursuing, sitting in your hands, finally and fully sufficient. Most people ask this question honestly, go quiet. Not because the answer is complicated, because the answer is unsettling. They search their memory for the moment and struggle to locate it. They can remember wanting. They can remember striving. They can remember the specific, sharp satisfaction of getting something they had worked for. But the feeling of enough, the settled, complete, nothing more required feeling that the word actually describes, is strangely absent from the inventory. Even from the moments that, by any external measure, should have produced it. This is not a personal failing. It is not evidence that you are uniquely ungrateful or unusually difficult to satisfy. It is the predictable result of a hunger that has been built into you, reinforced by the culture around you, and rewarded by an economy that depends on your continued dissatisfaction. The hunger for more does not pause to say thank you for what has already arrived. It does not linger in gratitude. It processes the achievement, briefly registers the pleasure, and immediately recalculates the distance to the next target. This is not a flaw in your character. It is the operating system most people in the modern world have inherited without ever being asked if they wanted it. This book is about something most people have never been taught to recognize, let alone pursue. Enough. Not as a number you eventually reach after sufficient accumulation. Not as resignation, the quiet giving up of someone who has decided that ambition is too tiring to continue. But enough as a genuine, available, daily practiced way of meeting your life. A specific quality of presence in which what is here is allowed to be sufficient, even as you continue to grow, to build, to want good things for yourself and the people you love. I want to be honest about what this book is not. It is not an argument for passivity. It is not a case for abandoning your ambitions or pretending that circumstances do not matter. Poverty is not peace. Struggle is not virtue. A person without enough to eat does not need a book about contentment. They need food, security, and the genuine material conditions that make a stable life possible. This book is written primarily for a different and increasingly common condition. The condition of having enough by almost any reasonable standard and still feeling, persistently and quietly, that you do not. The professional who has built a genuinely good life and cannot locate the satisfaction that the building was supposed to produce. The parent who has provided everything they once lacked and still lies awake, calculating what is missing. The person who has achieved the goal they set 5 years ago and discovered on arrival that the goalpost had already moved. If that describes you, even partially, you are not alone, and you are not broken. You are responding in the entirely predictable way that humans respond to a specific set of psychological, cultural, and economic forces that this book is going to name plainly and examine honestly. Understanding those forces is the first step, because you cannot escape a trap you cannot see. And the trap of perpetual more has been built so carefully and disguised so thoroughly as ambition, drive, and healthy aspiration that most people live their entire lives inside it without recognizing the walls. The chapters that follow are organized in 4 movements. We will first understand the problem, the moving finish line, and the machinery that keeps it moving. We will then trace the problem to its roots, the ancient survival wiring and the modern comparison engines that manufacture the hunger in the first place. We will then learn to recognize what enough actually feels like, distinct from resignation, distinct from complacency, distinct from anything you may have mistaken it for before. And finally, we will build the practice, the specific, daily, livable disciplines through which enough becomes not a rare and fleeting experience, but a genuine foundation for an ordinary life. This is not a book that asks you to want less. It is a book that asks you to notice what you already have long enough to actually receive it, before the mind moves on to calculating what is still missing. That noticing, practiced consistently, changes more than most people expect. Let's begin. Part 1. The Problem. Chapter 1. The Moving Finish Line. There is a specific moment that almost everyone who has pursued a significant goal eventually experiences, and almost no one talks about honestly. The moment of arrival. You picture it for months, sometimes years, in advance. The promotion finally granted, the number finally reached in the bank account, the relationship finally committed to, the body finally transformed, the house finally bought. In the picturing, the moment carries an emotional weight that feels, in advance, almost unbearably good. You imagine yourself in that moment, and the imagining produces a kind of preview of satisfaction so vivid that it becomes, in itself, one of the primary sources of motivation that carries you through the difficult work required to get there. And then you arrive, and something strange and quietly devastating happens, so quickly and so subtly that most people do not even register it as an event worth examining. The satisfaction is there, briefly, and then it is gone, replaced almost immediately by something the mind generates so automatically it barely feels like a choice. The recalculation. What's next? What still needs fixing? What the next, slightly larger version of this achievement would look like, and why you do not yet have it. This is not a personal flaw. It has a name in psychology and decades of research behind it. It is called the hedonic treadmill, and it describes one of the most well-documented and most consistently underestimated features of human psychology. Human beings adapt rapidly, automatically, and almost completely to almost any change in their circumstances, whether that change is positive or negative. The raise that felt life-changing when it was granted becomes, within months, simply your salary, the new baseline against which the next raise will be measured. The relationship that felt like the answer to years of loneliness becomes, within a year or two, simply your relationship, no longer remarkable, no longer the source of the daily gratitude it once produced. Researchers Philip Brickman and Donald Campbell, who coined the term in the early 1970s, studied this adaptation across an extraordinary range of circumstances, including one of the most striking comparisons in the history of happiness research. They examined the reported happiness of lottery winners and the reported happiness of people who had experienced severe, sudden paralysis. The lottery winners, predictably, reported a significant spike in happiness immediately following their win. What was not predictable, and what shocked researchers studying it for the first time, was how quickly that spike dissolved. Within roughly a year, lottery winners' overall reported happiness had returned to approximately the same baseline it had been before the win. And in a finding that still unsettles people encountering it for the first time, the people who had experienced sudden, severe paralysis also returned, within a similar time frame, to a baseline of happiness not dramatically lower than before their injury, once the acute crisis period had passed. The implication is uncomfortable but important. Circumstances, even extreme ones, in either direction, exert far less permanent influence over your felt sense of life satisfaction than your mind currently assumes. The promotion you are certain will finally make you feel successful will, with very high probability, deliver exactly the brief spike and rapid return to baseline that every previous achievement has delivered. This is not because the achievement was not genuinely good. It is because your psychological apparatus was built by millions of years of evolutionary pressure to do exactly this. To register a gain, briefly enjoy it, and then quickly stabilize back to a working baseline so that you remain motivated to keep seeking, keep striving, keep scanning the horizon for the next resource or advantage that might improve your chances of survival. This is the moving finish line. And once you see it clearly, you begin to notice it everywhere in your own life. The income level you were certain would feel like enough 5 years ago, that you have now surpassed without ever experiencing the enough you anticipated. The body you were certain would finally satisfy you, briefly achieved and then immediately followed by a new and more demanding standard. The relationship milestone, the job title, the square footage, the follower count. Each one approached with genuine conviction that this is the one that will finally produce the lasting satisfaction the previous ones did not. And each one, upon arrival, quietly and efficiently replaced by the next target before the satisfaction has had time to fully register. I want to be precise about what this chapter is and is not claiming. It is not claiming that goals are pointless, or that achievement does not matter, or that you should stop building a better life. Growth is real, and meaningful progress in your circumstances is genuinely valuable. What this chapter is claiming, and what the research overwhelmingly supports, is something more specific and more useful. The satisfaction you are seeking from the next achievement is not actually located in the achievement. It cannot be, because every previous achievement has demonstrated this with perfect, repeatable consistency. The satisfaction, if it exists at all, must be located somewhere else, somewhere available now, rather than somewhere perpetually deferred to the next finish line. That somewhere else is what the rest of this book is going to help you find. Not by asking you to stop running, but by asking you to notice, finally and honestly, that the finish line you have been running toward has never once stayed still long enough to be crossed. Chapter 2. The Machinery of More. The previous chapter described a feature of human psychology, the hedonic treadmill, that exists independently of any particular culture or economic system. It is, in some form, a part of being human, but there is something else operating alongside that natural tendency. Something that did not arise from evolution alone, and that deserves a far more critical examination than most people ever give it. someone is profiting from your dissatisfaction. Specifically, predictably, and on a scale that most people genuinely underestimate. Consider the basic structure of modern consumer advertising. Its function, stated plainly rather than in the soft language usually used to describe it, is to manufacture a feeling of lack where none previously existed, and then to offer a product as the resolution to the lack it just created. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the explicitly stated goal of the advertising and marketing industries, described openly in their own professional literature for over a century. Edward Bernays, often considered the father of modern public relations and a nephew of Sigmund Freud, wrote candidly in the early 20th century about applying his uncle's insights into unconscious desire to the deliberate engineering of consumer want. The goal, in his own words, was to connect products not to needs people already had, but to deeper psychological desires for status, belonging, and identity that the product could be made to symbolically represent. This insight became the foundation of an entire industry. You are rarely sold a car based on its function of transporting you from one location to another. You are sold an identity, a feeling of competence or freedom or desirability, with the car positioned as the vehicle, quite literally, through which that feeling becomes accessible. The advertisement does not simply present an item for sale. It first establishes, often through extremely subtle visual and emotional cues, that something is currently missing from your life. A status you have not yet attained. A version of yourself you have not yet become. A form of belonging you have not yet secured. Only after that absence has been established, sometimes in the space of a 15-second video, is the product offered as the specific remedy. This machinery has become significantly more sophisticated and significantly more pervasive in the digital age. Social media platforms, in particular, represent perhaps the most powerful comparison-generating technology ever created. And their business model depends directly on your continued sense that you are missing something others have. The platforms themselves are not neutral tools that happen to display other people's lives. They are engineered through extensive behavioral research and continuous algorithmic refinement to maximize engagement, and one of the most reliable predictors of engagement is exactly the kind of social comparison that produces dissatisfaction. Researchers studying social media use have repeatedly found a correlation between the amount of time spent passively scrolling through curated images of other people's lives and decreased life satisfaction, increased anxiety, and a heightened sense of one's own inadequacy. This is not an accident of the technology. It is the direct, profitable result of a system optimized to keep you looking, comparing, and wanting. The platform earns revenue from your attention, and your attention is most reliably captured by content that triggers a strong emotional response. Comparison, particularly upward comparison to people who appear to have more, triggers exactly that response with remarkable consistency. There is a deeper cultural layer beneath even the advertising and the algorithms, one that sociologists have studied for generations under the term positional goods. A positional good is something whose value to you depends not on its absolute quality, but on how it compares to what others around you have. A house of a certain size, for example, might feel perfectly adequate in a neighborhood where most homes are similar. and inadequate in a neighborhood where most homes are larger, even though the house itself has not changed in any way. Economist Robert Frank has documented extensively how the pursuit of positional goods creates a kind of arms race with no possible winner. Because the moment your position improves relative to your reference group adjusts, often by your own choice of who to compare yourself to, and the relative gap reasserts itself. This explains something that puzzles many people about their own dissatisfaction. Why someone earning a genuinely substantial income by almost any historical or global standard can feel persistently financially anxious. The anxiety rarely comes from an absolute shortage of resources. It comes from a comparison to a specific, often unconsciously selected reference group, frequently composed of people slightly ahead of them, whose presence in their social environment, whether through actual proximity or through the curated visibility of social media, keeps recalibrating what feels like enough. Understanding this machinery does not, on its own, dissolve its power over you, but it does something important. It externalizes a hunger you may have assumed was simply an internal personal failing, and reveals it instead as the predictable output of forces specifically designed and continuously refined to produce exactly the feeling you have been experiencing. You did not fail to feel satisfied because something is wrong with you. You feel dissatisfied with remarkable reliability because an enormous and highly sophisticated system has a direct financial interest in your continued belief that satisfaction is one purchase, one promotion, one upgrade away. Seeing the machinery clearly is the first act of resistance against it. Chapter 3. The Body Keeps Score. So far, this book has discussed the moving finish line and the machinery of more largely as psychological and cultural phenomena. But there is a more concrete and more urgent dimension to this discussion that deserves equal attention. Because chronic dissatisfaction is not simply an unpleasant mental state that passes through harmlessly. It registers in your body, accumulates there, and produces measurable physiological consequences that compound over the years you spend chasing a finish line that never holds still. Your nervous system did not evolve to distinguish clearly between the specific, urgent threat of a predator and the diffuse, chronic, low-grade sense that you are not yet where you should be. Both register, to a significant degree, through the same basic stress response system. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, often abbreviated as the HPA axis, is the body's primary stress response mechanism, and it was built for short bursts of acute activation followed by recovery. A genuine threat appears, cortisol and adrenaline surge. The body mobilizes resources for fight or flight, the threat resolves, and the system returns to baseline. This is the pattern the human stress response was designed around across millions of years of evolutionary history. The hunger for more does not work this way. It does not present a single, resolvable threat. It presents an ongoing, perpetually unresolved sense that something necessary is still missing. A sense that, by its very nature, the previous 2 chapters have shown does not resolve even when the specific goal is achieved. This produces what researchers in the field of psychoneuroimmunology call chronic low-grade stress activation, a state in which the stress response system never fully returns to its resting baseline. Because the perceived threat, in this case the perceived insufficiency of your current circumstances, never actually goes away. The physical consequences of this chronic activation are well documented across decades of medical research. Sustained elevated cortisol levels have been associated with suppressed immune function, increased inflammation throughout the body, disrupted sleep architecture, impaired memory consolidation, and immeasurably increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Robert Sapolsky, the Stanford neuroscientist whose decades of research on stress physiology have become foundational in this field, has written extensively about how the human stress response, so well suited to brief physical emergencies, becomes genuinely harmful when activated continuously by the kind of ongoing psychological pressure that modern life, and particularly the modern pursuit of more, reliably generates. There's a particularly important and frequently overlooked dimension to this called allostatic load, a term used to describe the cumulative wear and tear that chronic stress places on the body over time. Unlike acute stress, which resolves and leaves relatively little lasting trace once the threat passes, chronic stress accumulates. Each day spent in a state of low-grade dissatisfaction, each unresolved sense of not yet having arrived, contributes incrementally to a kind of physiological debt that compounds across years and decades. This debt manifests differently in different people, sometimes as cardiovascular issues, sometimes as metabolic disruption, sometimes as a weakened immune response that shows up as frequent minor illness. But the underlying mechanism, the body's continuous low-level mobilization in response to a threat that never resolves, is remarkably consistent. There is also a specific and important effect on the brain's capacity for present-moment attention. Chronic activation of the stress response preferentially engages what neuroscientists call the brain's threat detection and future-oriented planning circuitry, particularly regions associated with vigilance and anticipation. This comes at a measurable cost to the brain's capacity to fully register and process present-moment experience. The very thing this book is eventually going to argue is the actual location of the peace you have been chasing through achievement. In simple terms, a nervous system continuously oriented toward what is still missing becomes measurably less capable of fully experiencing what is already here, even when that present experience is genuinely good. This creates a particularly cruel feedback loop. The chronic stress generated by the pursuit of more degrades your capacity to fully experience and appreciate what you achieve, which in turn makes each achievement feel less satisfying than it should, which in turn intensifies the perceived need to pursue the next one, sustaining the very stress response that is degrading your capacity to feel satisfied in the first place. I want to be clear that this chapter is not intended to produce additional anxiety about the harm your ambition may already be causing your body. That would simply be another version of the same trap. Another reason to feel that something is wrong that urgently needs fixing. The point of this chapter is more straightforward and, I hope, more genuinely useful. The discomfort you may already sense in your body, the tension, the disrupted sleep, the difficulty fully relaxing even in moments that are objectively restful, is not separate from the psychological pattern this book has been describing. It is the same pattern, registering in tissue and hormone and nervous system function rather than in conscious thought. This matters because it means the solution this book is building toward cannot remain purely intellectual. Understanding the moving finish line and the machinery of more while genuinely useful, is not sufficient on its own to produce the physiological shift toward enough. That shift requires something the next several chapters are going to address directly, a practice capable of actually calming the nervous system's chronic activation, rather than simply giving the mind new information to think about, while the body continues to brace for a threat that the mind has labeled, perhaps with good intention, but with limited effect, as not actually dangerous. The body keeps score, faithfully and without exception. The good news is that the body can also learn, given the right consistent input, to put the score down. Part 2. The Roots. Chapter 4. The Scarcity Mind. Part 1 of this book examined the problem. The moving finish line that never holds still, the machinery of more that profits from your dissatisfaction, and the physical cost that chronic wanting exacts on the body over time. Part 2 now turns to a deeper and more fundamental question. Where does this hunger actually come from in the first place? The answer begins not in modern culture, but in the deep evolutionary history that shaped the brain you currently carry around in your skull. For the overwhelming majority of human history, scarcity was not a psychological pattern. It was the literal, daily condition of survival. Food was uncertain, shelter was precarious. Resources fluctuated unpredictably with seasons, weather, and the success or failure of a hunt. In this environment, a brain wired to constantly scan for threats, to relentlessly seek additional resources even when current resources seemed adequate, and to never fully relax into a sense of having enough, was not a psychologically unhealthy brain. It was, quite literally, a survival advantage. The individuals who felt persistently uneasy about their resource levels, who kept seeking more even when their immediate needs were met, were the individuals statistically more likely to survive a sudden drought, a failed harvest, or an unexpectedly harsh winter. Their anxiety, in the context of genuine and recurring scarcity, was adaptive. This is the foundation of what researchers in evolutionary psychology call the scarcity mindset. And it is important to understand that this is not a metaphor. It describes a set of genuinely ancient neural circuits, particularly involving the amygdala and the broader threat detection systems of the brain, that evolved across hundreds of thousands of years in an environment of real and recurring material scarcity. These circuits do not update quickly. They were not designed by evolution to respond to the comparatively novel and historically unprecedented conditions that a significant portion of the modern world now lives in. Conditions in which, for many people, genuine survival-level scarcity has been replaced by relative abundance, while the ancient threat detection circuitry continues operating exactly as it did when scarcity was a constant and literal threat. This mismatch between ancient wiring and modern circumstance has been studied extensively by researchers including Sendil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir, whose influential research on scarcity demonstrated something particularly important. They found that the psychological experience of scarcity, whether the scarcity is real or merely perceived, consumes a measurable portion of what they termed cognitive bandwidth. The mental resources available for thinking clearly, planning effectively, and making good decisions. Their research showed that individuals experiencing financial scarcity performed measurably worse on cognitive tests, not because of any difference in underlying intelligence, but because a significant portion of their mental processing capacity was continuously occupied by scarcity-related thoughts, leaving less available for the task directly in front of them. What makes this research particularly relevant to this book is a further and more unsettling finding. The scarcity mindset, once activated, does not require actual material scarcity to persist. It can be triggered and sustained by perceived scarcity, by a felt sense of not having enough relative to some reference point, regardless of whether that felt sense corresponds to genuine survival-level need. This means a person with substantial financial resources can experience the same cognitive narrowing, the same persistent low-grade anxiety, and the same compulsive resource-seeking behavior as someone facing genuine material hardship, simply because their nervous system has been triggered into the same ancient threat response pattern by a perceived gap between what they have and what they believe they need. This is the deeper explanation for a pattern many people notice, but rarely examine closely. Why does increasing your income rarely produce the lasting sense of security you anticipated? Why does each new financial milestone seem to reveal a new and previously invisible category of inadequacy just beyond it? The scarcity mind, operating on ancient survival logic, does not register absolute resource levels in any stable way. It registers gaps relative to a constantly shifting reference point. And as discussed in Chapter 2, that reference point is continuously and deliberately recalibrated upward by the cultural and commercial forces surrounding you. There is something genuinely important to understand here, and it requires a measure of self-compassion that this book will return to repeatedly. If you have struggled to feel that you have enough, despite genuine and substantial achievement, this is not evidence of some unusual personal flaw or excessive greed. It is evidence that you possess a normally functioning human nervous system, one inherited from ancestors for whom this exact pattern of vigilant resource seeking meant the difference between survival and extinction. The scarcity mind is not broken. It is doing precisely what it evolved to do. The problem is not that something is wrong with this ancient system. The problem is that the ancient system was never designed for, and has not yet adapted to, the specific conditions of relative abundance and constant manufactured comparison that define much of modern life. This distinction matters enormously for what comes next in this book. You are not trying to fix a defect. You are attempting something more interesting and ultimately more achievable. You are attempting to consciously update a system that operates largely outside conscious awareness. To teach an ancient and deeply ingrained survival mechanism that, in this particular moment, in this particular life, it may finally be safe enough to stand down. That teaching is possible. The chapters ahead will show you how it begins. Chapter 5. The Wound Beneath the Want. The previous chapter explained why the human nervous system, shaped by ancient survival pressures, tends toward a persistent sense of insufficiency, even in conditions of genuine abundance. This chapter turns to a more personal and often more uncomfortable layer beneath the general pattern. Because while the scarcity mind explains the universal human tendency toward more, it does not fully explain why your particular hunger takes the particular shape it does. Why one person chases money relentlessly while feeling genuinely indifferent to status. Why another person chases recognition and achievement while feeling little pull toward material accumulation. Why the specific thing you cannot seem to get enough of is this thing, and not some other equally available object of pursuit. Often, beneath the specific shape of an adult's ambition, there is an earlier and more personal story. Psychologists who study attachment and early development have long observed that the specific things a person pursues most relentlessly in adulthood frequently trace back to specific things that were missing, inconsistent, or conditional in childhood. This is not a claim that ambition itself is pathological, or that every successful person is simply acting out an unresolved childhood wound. It is a more precise and more useful observation. The intensity, the specific flavor, and the particular insatiability of a person's pursuit of more often reveals something about what that pursuit is unconsciously trying to resolve. Consider a pattern that therapists who work with high achievers encounter with notable regularity. A person who grew up in a household where love or attention felt conditional on performance, where approval arrived reliably after success and felt noticeably absent or diminished after failure, frequently grows into an adult who pursues achievement with a particular kind of relentlessness that looks, from the outside, like ordinary ambition, but that carries underneath a very different emotional structure. For this person, achievement is not simply pursued because it is enjoyable or because the outcome is genuinely desired. It is pursued because, somewhere below conscious awareness, achievement has become equated with safety, with worthiness, with the basic right to take up space and be loved. No amount of actual achievement can fully resolve this kind of pursuit, because the achievement was never really the target. The target was the unmet need underneath it, the need to feel inherently, unconditionally valuable, a need that external accomplishment, no matter how substantial, cannot directly satisfy. This pattern was extensively documented by Alice Miller, whose influential work on what she termed the drama of the gifted child described precisely this dynamic. Children who learned early that their authentic feelings and needs were less important than meeting the expectations or emotional needs of caregivers often develop into adults with an extraordinarily well-developed capacity for achievement, alongside a persistent, hard-to-name sense of emptiness that achievement never quite fills. Miller observed that these individuals frequently described their accomplishments almost as if observing someone else's life, experiencing a strange hollowness even at moments of genuine, externally validated success. A related and equally important pattern involves financial scarcity experienced specifically during childhood, regardless of a person's current financial circumstances. Research on what is sometimes called scarcity imprinting has found that individuals who experienced genuine financial insecurity as children frequently carry forward a felt sense of financial vulnerability into adulthood that does not respond proportionally to actual changes in their financial situation. A person who grew up genuinely uncertain whether there would be enough money for groceries can become, decades later, a person earning a substantial income who still experiences acute, body-level anxiety about money, an anxiety that no amount of current financial security seems able to fully resolve. The nervous system, having learned in formative years that financial resources were genuinely and unpredictably scarce, continues operating from that learned premise long after the actual circumstances have changed. It is important to be careful here, because this kind of explanation can easily slide into either of two unhelpful directions. The first is using it as a tool for excessive self-diagnosis, endlessly tracing every adult preference back to some specific childhood wound in a way that becomes its own form of distraction rather than genuine insight. The second is using it to assign blame, treating parents or circumstances as villains in a story that was, for almost everyone, considerably more complicated than blame allows for. Neither of these is the purpose of this chapter. The purpose is something more practical. When you notice a particular area of your life where the hunger for more feels especially intense, especially difficult to satisfy regardless of objective progress, it is worth asking a quiet and honest question. What might this pursuit actually be standing in for? Not as an accusation, but as genuine curiosity. If the underlying need is for safety, then accumulating money beyond a reasonably defined and genuinely sufficient amount will not produce safety, because the actual deficit being addressed is not financial. If the underlying need is for unconditional worth, then no professional accomplishment, however impressive, will produce that worth. Because accomplishment, by its nature, is conditional, and a need for unconditional worth cannot be met by anything conditional. This is often the precise mechanism by which the moving finish line described in Chapter 1 keeps moving. Not simply because of evolutionary scarcity wiring, though that plays its part, but because the actual target was never really the visible goal in the first place. The visible goal, the money, the title, the recognition, was a proxy, an attempted stand-in for something earlier, more personal, and not actually obtainable through external achievement. Identifying this is not, on its own, sufficient to dissolve the pattern. But it is an essential and often overlooked step, because a hunger that is misunderstood will always seek satisfaction in the wrong place, no matter how skillfully or how relentlessly it is pursued. The chapters ahead will offer a different kind of satisfaction, one not dependent on resolving every unmet childhood need before peace becomes available, but one that can begin to address even old and deep wounds through a quality of present attention that, as you will see, the wound itself has rarely, if ever, received. Chapter 6: Comparison and the Death of Contentment. There is a quiet and almost universal human experience that deserves more attention than it typically receives. You can be sitting in genuine comfort, having just finished a satisfying meal, in a home that meets your needs, surrounded by people you love, and within the space of 30 seconds spent scrolling through a screen, feel a distinct and unmistakable shift toward dissatisfaction. Nothing in your actual circumstances changed in those 30 seconds. What changed was your reference point. This chapter examines comparison, perhaps the single most direct and most underestimated mechanism by which contentment, once present, gets quietly dismantled. The foundational psychological theory here was developed by social psychologist Leon Festinger in the 1950s in what he called social comparison theory. Festinger observed that human beings have a deeply ingrained drive to evaluate themselves, not through some fixed internal standard, but through comparison with others. This is not a personality flaw present in some people and absent in others. Festinger's research suggested it is a basic feature of human social cognition, present to some degree in virtually everyone. Because for social creatures whose survival has always depended on group standing, knowing where you fall relative to others has historically carried genuine practical importance. What Festinger could not have fully anticipated, writing decades before the internet existed, was the scale and intensity of comparison that modern technology would eventually make possible. For most of human history, your comparison group was necessarily limited. You compared yourself to the people in your village, your extended family, your immediate community, perhaps a few dozen or a few hundred people whose actual circumstances you could observe directly and accurately, including their genuine struggles, their failures, and the full, unfiltered texture of their actual lives. The modern comparison environment bears almost no resemblance to this. Social media platforms now expose the average user to curated glimpses into the lives of hundreds or even thousands of people daily. And critically, these glimpses are not representative samples of those people's actual lives. They are highlight reels, carefully selected and frequently edited to display only the most flattering, most enviable, most successful appearing fragments of an existence whose full reality, including its struggles, disappointments, and ordinary tedium, remains almost entirely invisible. Researchers studying this phenomenon have given it a specific name, the highlight reel effect, and its psychological consequences have been documented extensively. A landmark study published in the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology found that limiting social media use to approximately 30 minutes per day produced significant reductions in loneliness and depression among participants within just a few weeks. Other research, including work conducted at the University of Michigan, found that the more time individuals spent on platforms like Facebook, the more their reported life satisfaction declined over time, an effect that held even after controlling for the possibility that already unhappy people simply used social media more. The mechanism behind this damage is what social comparison researchers call upward comparison, the specific and most psychologically costly form of comparison in which you measure your own life against someone whose circumstances, or at least whose displayed circumstances, appear superior to your own. Unlike downward comparison, in which you compare yourself to someone in a less favorable position and frequently experience a temporary boost in satisfaction, upward comparison reliably produces the opposite effect, and the curated nature of social media, combined with its algorithmic tendency to surface exactly the content most likely to generate strong engagement, means that upward comparison material is being served to users with unprecedented frequency and unprecedented psychological sophistication. It is worth pausing on a particularly important and counterintuitive insight from this research. The comparisons that damage contentment most severely are very rarely comparisons to people whose lives are dramatically different from your own. You are unlikely to feel genuinely diminished by the lifestyle of a celebrity whose existence seems entirely disconnected from your own possible reality. The comparisons that cut deepest are comparisons to people who occupy a similar reference category to your own. Former classmates, professional peers, people roughly your age and roughly your background, whose apparent success suggests, by uncomfortable implication, what should also be achievable for you. This is precisely why social media, which surfaces content from your actual existing social network with particular prominence, proves so much more psychologically corrosive than comparison to distant celebrities ever was. There is a deeper philosophical point underlying all of this research, one worth stating plainly. Contentment, when it depends on relative position, can never be stable, because relative position is, by definition, perpetually contestable and perpetually subject to revision. There will always exist, somewhere, someone with more. And in the age of global digital connectivity, that someone is now perpetually visible to you, in carefully curated form, multiple times per day. A contentment built on comparison is therefore not really contentment at all. It is a temporary and precarious truce, valid only until the next piece of comparison material appears, which on most platforms now occurs within seconds. This does not mean comparison can simply be eliminated through willpower. Nor does this book suggest that complete withdrawal from social technology is the only viable solution. Though for some people, meaningful reduction proves genuinely valuable. What this chapter is building toward is something more fundamental, addressed directly in the chapters ahead. A form of contentment that does not depend on relative position at all. A felt sense of enough that is evaluated against your own actual life and your own actual values, rather than against an ever-shifting, carefully curated parade of other people's highlight reels. That kind of contentment is not naturally occurring in most people, particularly in the current technological environment. It must be deliberately cultivated. The next part of this book begins that cultivation in earnest. Part 3. The Shift. Chapter 7. What Enough Actually Feels Like. Part 1 of this book described the problem of perpetual dissatisfaction. Part 2 traced that problem to its roots in evolutionary wiring, personal history, and the comparison machinery of modern culture. Part 3 now begins something different. It begins the actual work of recognizing what enough feels like. Because here is an uncomfortable truth worth stating directly. Most people, even after understanding everything covered so far, would still struggle to identify the felt sense of enough if it arrived in their body right now. They have spent so many years oriented toward what is missing that the sensation of sufficiency, when it does occasionally appear, often passes unnoticed, mistaken for boredom or restlessness, or a vague sense that something must be wrong precisely because nothing currently feels urgently wrong. This chapter exists to correct that, to give you, in specific and embodied terms, a way of recognizing enough when it is actually present. Begin with what enough is not, because the confusion here causes significant, unnecessary suffering. Enough is not the same as complacency. Complacency involves a kind of passive resignation, a quiet giving up on growth or improvement, often accompanied by a low background hum of denial about genuine problems that deserve attention. Enough, as this book uses the term, involves no such resignation. A person who has accessed a genuine felt sense of enough can still want to grow, still pursue meaningful goals, still work to improve their circumstances or their skills. The difference is not in the presence or absence of ambition. The difference is in the relationship between that ambition and the person's basic sense of okayness in the present moment. Enough is also not the same as having achieved some objectively sufficient quantity of resources. This is one of the most persistent and most costly misunderstandings people carry. The belief that enough is a number, a threshold that, once crossed, will automatically produce the feeling. The research discussed in Chapter 1 demonstrated clearly why this cannot work. The hedonic treadmill ensures that whatever threshold you currently believe would produce enough will, upon being reached, simply generate a new and slightly higher threshold. Enough, properly understood, cannot be a fixed external quantity, because external quantities are infinitely expandable, and the mind that chases them is built to keep expanding the target indefinitely. So what is enough? If it is neither resignation nor a specific external quantity. Enough is a felt, embodied state, characterized by several specific and recognizable qualities worth examining individually so that you can begin to identify them when they occur in your own experience. The first quality is what might be called settling. A genuine relaxation in the body, particularly noticeable in the chest, shoulders, and jaw. Areas where chronic low-grade stress activation, discussed in Chapter 3, tends to concentrate tension. When enough is genuinely present, even briefly, there is often a physical sensation of the body releasing a low level of bracing that had become so habitual it was no longer consciously noticed. People who begin paying close attention to this sensation frequently report surprise at how rarely they had previously experienced it, and how much background tension had simply become their normal, unexamined baseline. The second quality is the absence of urgent comparison. In a moment of genuine enough, the mind is not actively measuring your current circumstances against some other person's circumstances or against some future, improved version of your own life. This does not mean comparison thoughts never arise during such moments. It means that, in this particular moment, the mind is not actively engaged in the comparison process, and as a result, there is a kind of spaciousness available that comparison consistently crowds out. The third quality is what researchers studying gratitude and well-being sometimes call sufficiency awareness, a specific cognitive shift in which attention moves toward what is currently present and functioning, rather than remaining fixed on what is currently absent or insufficient. This is not the same as forced positive thinking, which often involves a kind of effortful denial of genuine difficulties. Sufficiency awareness can coexist quite comfortably with an accurate acknowledgement that certain things in your life remain genuinely difficult or unresolved. The shift is not in denying difficulty, but in allowing attention to also register with equal honesty what is currently working, present, and sufficient. The fourth quality, and perhaps the most subtle, is a kind of temporal settling. A felt sense that the present moment does not need to be rushed through on the way to some better future moment. Robert Emmons, one of the leading researchers studying gratitude, has written about how chronic dissatisfaction often produces a particular relationship with time, in which the present is experienced primarily as a means to an end, a stepping stone toward some anticipated future state, rather than as something with its own inherent, currently available value. Enough involves a reversal of this orientation, even if only briefly. The present moment becomes something worth being in, rather than something to be endured on the way to somewhere better. I want to offer a specific and practical exercise here, one you can use immediately, not as a comprehensive solution, but as a first concrete experience of what this chapter has been describing in more abstract terms. Pause right now and notice 3 things that are currently true and currently sufficient. This does not require ignoring genuine problems or pretending everything is perfect. It simply requires, briefly and deliberately, directing attention toward what is already working. Perhaps your breathing, occurring without effort, sustaining your life in this exact moment without requiring you to manage it. Perhaps a relationship that, whatever its imperfections, is genuinely present and genuinely supportive. Perhaps simply the fact that, in this specific moment, you are not in pain, not in danger, not facing any urgent crisis requiring immediate response. As you notice each of these things, pay attention to what happens in your body. Not what you think should happen, but what actually happens. There is often, even in this brief and simple exercise, a small but genuine shift, a slight loosening, a small available exhale. That shift, however brief, however subtle, is enough making itself known. It has likely been available to you many times before, in many ordinary moments, arriving and departing largely unnoticed because attention was elsewhere, oriented toward what was still missing. The remaining chapters of this part and the practices in Part 4 are designed to help you notice this felt sense more reliably, more frequently, and eventually, to help you learn to rest in it, not as an occasional accident, but as an increasingly available and stable foundation for an ordinary life. Chapter 8. Presence as the Doorway. The previous chapter described what enough actually feels like. The settling in the body, the absence of urgent comparison, the temporal shift away from rushing toward a better future and toward a genuine availability to the present. This chapter examines a question that follows naturally from that description. If enough is a felt sense available in the present moment, why is it so consistently difficult to access, even when, by every reasonable external measure, current circumstances would seem to justify it? The answer lies in a simple but profoundly important fact about where the mind actually spends most of its time. And the research here is more precise and more striking than most people expect. A landmark study conducted by psychologists Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert at Harvard, published in the journal Science, used a specially designed smartphone application to sample the real-time experience of thousands of people across a wide range of daily activities. The application would prompt participants at random intervals throughout the day, asking what they were currently doing and, critically, whether their mind was currently focused on that activity or had wandered elsewhere. The results were remarkable in their scale and their consistency. Participants reported that their minds were wandering away from their current activity, on average, during nearly half of all waking hours, across virtually every category of activity studied. What makes this finding particularly relevant to the subject of this book is a second and equally important result from the same research. Mind wandering was strongly associated with reduced happiness. And crucially, the researchers found this relationship held regardless of what the mind was wandering toward. Even mind wandering toward pleasant topics produced lower reported happiness than simply remaining present with whatever activity, however mundane, was actually occurring. The researchers concluded, in language that has since become widely cited, that the human mind is, in a meaningful sense, a wandering mind, and that this wandering mind is, with notable consistency, an unhappy mind. This finding connects directly to everything discussed in the previous parts of this book. The hunger for more, the scarcity wiring, the comparison machinery, all of these operate primarily by pulling attention away from the present moment and redirecting it toward an imagined future in which the missing thing has finally been obtained, or toward a remembered or imagined comparison in which someone else's circumstances are evaluated against your own. Enough, as described in the previous chapter, cannot be located in either of these places. because enough is fundamentally a quality of present experience, and the future does not yet exist, while the comparison exists only as a mental construction, however vivid it may feel. This is why presence functions as the doorway to enough, rather than as merely one helpful technique among many. It is not simply that being present makes you feel calmer in some general sense, though it often does. It is that enough, by its very nature, can only be experienced in the present, because the present is the only location in which direct experience actually occurs. The future is always, by definition, anticipated rather than directly experienced, and anticipation, as research on the hedonic treadmill demonstrated, is notoriously unreliable as a predictor of how a future moment will actually feel once it arrives. Buddhist contemplative traditions identified this insight many centuries before. Western psychology developed the research tools to confirm it empirically. The concept of dukkha, often translated as suffering or dissatisfaction, is traditionally understood not as referring primarily to acute pain or tragedy, but to a more pervasive and subtle quality of ordinary experience. The persistent sense that the present moment is somehow incomplete, that satisfaction lies just ahead in some future state not yet reached. Contemplative practice, across nearly every tradition that has developed sustained methods for working with the mind, converges on a remarkably consistent insight. This sense of incompleteness is not actually a feature of present experience itself. It is a feature of the mind's habitual relationship to present experience, specifically its tendency to evaluate the present primarily in terms of its usefulness for reaching some anticipated future state. Jon Kabat-Zinn, whose work bringing mindfulness practice into mainstream medical and psychological settings has been extensively studied, describes this as the difference between being and doing. The doing mode of mind is oriented toward closing the gap between the current state and some desired future state. And this mode is genuinely useful and necessary for accomplishing practical tasks. But when the doing mode becomes the mind's default and near constant orientation, even during moments that have no practical task requiring it, the result is a kind of perpetual low-grade dissatisfaction, because the doing mode is structurally incapable of registering present sufficiency. Its entire function depends on perceiving a gap that still needs closing. Being mode, by contrast, involves a different relationship to experience, one in which the present moment is registered directly on its own terms, rather than primarily evaluated for its progress toward some future goal. Research using functional brain imaging has found that sustained practice in shifting toward being mode, primarily through mindfulness meditation, produces measurable changes in brain activity, including reduced activity in regions associated with self-referential rumination and increased activity in regions associated with present moment sensory processing. This research matters enormously for the practical purpose of this book, because it demonstrates that the capacity for presence, and therefore the capacity for accessing enough, is not a fixed trait some people simply have and others lack. It is a trainable capacity, demonstrated repeatedly across decades of research on contemplative practice. And like any trained capacity, it strengthens with consistent, deliberate practice and atrophies with neglect. The practical implication is direct. If enough can only be experienced in the present moment, and if the untrained mind defaults to wandering away from the present nearly half of the time, then any serious pursuit of enough must include a serious commitment to strengthening the capacity for presence. This is not a peripheral suggestion offered alongside the main work of this book. It is, in a very real sense, the central practical doorway through which everything else this book describes actually becomes accessible in lived experience rather than remaining merely a set of interesting ideas. The chapters that follow in Part 4 will offer specific, practical methods for developing this capacity. But the foundational insight of this chapter is worth holding clearly before moving forward. You are not seeking enough somewhere out in your future circumstances. You are seeking the capacity to actually arrive in the present moment that already, in ways you may not yet have fully noticed, contains it. Chapter 9. Gratitude as a discipline, not a mood. There is a common misunderstanding about gratitude that this chapter needs to address directly before going any further, because the misunderstanding itself is part of why gratitude so often fails to produce the lasting shift people hope for when they first encounter the idea. Most people treat gratitude as a feeling, something that either arises spontaneously when circumstances are favorable, or that fails to arise when circumstances feel insufficient. Under this understanding, gratitude becomes essentially a passive barometer, registering whether your life is currently good enough to justify the feeling. This is precisely backward, and the research on gratitude developed over the past several decades demonstrates why. Gratitude, properly understood and properly practiced, is not primarily a feeling. It is a discipline, a specific and trainable cognitive skill involving the deliberate redirection of attention toward what is present and sufficient. Practiced consistently enough that it eventually begins to retrain the mind's default perceptual habits. This distinction matters enormously, because a feeling cannot be reliably produced on command. But a discipline can be practiced regardless of current mood. And research consistently shows that the practice, sustained over time, produces the feeling far more reliably than waiting for the feeling to arrive on its own ever does. Robert Emmons, whose research on gratitude at the University of California, Davis, represents some of the most rigorous work in this field, conducted a series of controlled studies examining what happens when people are asked to deliberately practice gratitude, regardless of their current circumstances or mood. In one influential study, participants were divided into groups and asked to keep weekly records. One group recording things they were grateful for, another recording daily hassles and irritations, and a third recording neutral life events without any particular emotional framing. After 10 weeks, the gratitude group showed significantly higher levels of life satisfaction, more optimism about the future, fewer physical health complaints, and even reported exercising more compared to the other two groups. What makes this research particularly important for the subject of this book is that the gratitude practice did not depend on participants' circumstances actually changing. The same life events, the same external conditions, were available to be perceived through either a lens of hassle and complaint or a lens of sufficiency and appreciation. The deliberate practice of directing attention toward the latter, sustained consistently over a period of weeks, produced measurable improvements in overall well-being, demonstrating clearly that gratitude functions as an active perceptual training, not a passive response to favorable circumstances. This connects directly to an important concept from Chapter 4. The scarcity mind shaped by evolutionary pressure to scan continuously for threats and unmet needs. That ancient threat detection system, left to its own default settings, will reliably notice what is missing far more readily than it notices what is present and sufficient. This is not a personal failing. It is simply what an unattended threat detection system does by design. Gratitude practice functions as a direct and deliberate counterweight to this default, training attention to also register, with equal seriousness, the evidence of sufficiency that the threat detection system, left unattended, would otherwise consistently overlook. There is a particularly useful neuroscientific concept relevant here, sometimes called the brain's negativity bias. Psychologist Rick Hanson has written extensively about this bias, describing the brain as being, in his memorable phrase, like Velcro for negative experiences and Teflon for positive ones. Negative or threatening information tends to be processed more thoroughly, stored more durably, and recalled more readily than positive or neutral information. A pattern that made excellent evolutionary sense when negative information frequently meant the difference between survival and death. But that produces, in the comparatively safer conditions many people now live in, a persistent and disproportionate weighting toward what is wrong, missing, or insufficient. Hanson's research and clinical work led him to develop a specific technique he calls taking in the good, a deliberate practice of not simply noticing positive experiences, but actively pausing with them, allowing them to register more fully and for a longer duration than the brain's default Teflon-like processing would otherwise permit. His research suggests that this extended attention to positive experience, even when practiced for only 20 or 30 seconds at a time, but repeated consistently, can meaningfully shift the brain's habitual balance between negative and positive processing over weeks and months of sustained practice. This gives a specific and practical shape to what gratitude discipline actually involves. Distinct from the vaguer cultural instruction to simply be more grateful, the practice has several concrete components worth distinguishing clearly. First, deliberate noticing. The active scanning for things that are currently sufficient or good, rather than passively waiting for such things to spontaneously announce themselves to an attention that remains, by default, oriented elsewhere. Second, extended dwelling. Pausing with whatever has been noticed for long enough that it actually registers, rather than mentally checking a box and immediately moving on, which research suggests produces far weaker and far less durable effects. Third, specificity. Directing attention toward particular, concrete details rather than vague general categories. Since research by Emmons and others has found that specific gratitude for this particular conversation, this particular moment of warmth from the sun through a window, this particular instance of someone's kindness, produces stronger effects than generic gratitude for broad categories like health or family. It is worth addressing directly a concern that arises naturally for many readers at this point. Does practicing gratitude for what is currently present risk producing the very complacency this book explicitly distinguished from enough back in Chapter 7? The research, along with the lived experience of people who have sustained this practice over time, suggests the opposite tends to occur. Gratitude practice, properly understood, does not require denying that improvement is possible or desirable. It simply ensures that improvement is pursued from a foundation of genuine present sufficiency, rather than from the chronic, body-level sense of lack described in Chapter 3. People who practice gratitude consistently frequently report not less ambition, but a different and notably less anxious relationship to their ambition, pursuing growth because it is genuinely desired, rather than because the absence of it feels like an intolerable and urgent deficiency. Gratitude, practiced as a genuine discipline rather than waited for as an occasional mood, is one of the most well-researched and most practically accessible tools available for retraining a mind that has spent years or decades defaulting toward what is missing. It does not require favorable circumstances to begin. It requires only the willingness to practice it consistently, particularly, and perhaps especially, on the days when it feels least automatic. Part 4. The Practice. Chapter 10. Wanting Without Suffering. Part 3 of this book established what enough actually feels like, why presence functions as its only true doorway, and how gratitude operates as a trainable discipline rather than a passive mood. Part 4 now turns to the practical, daily work of actually living from this foundation. And the first question this part must address is one that has likely been forming throughout the previous chapters, sometimes as quiet skepticism, sometimes as outright resistance. If enough is genuinely available in the present moment, does that mean wanting anything more is somehow a mistake? Does this book ultimately argue that desire itself is the problem? It does not. And this distinction matters enormously, because getting it wrong leads either toward a hollow, forced indifference that denies genuine human aspiration, or toward dismissing this entire book as impractical idealism unsuited to anyone who actually wants to build something meaningful with their life. The distinction this chapter draws is between desire and attachment, a distinction with deep roots in contemplative traditions and increasing support from contemporary psychological research. Desire, in its simplest form, is the recognition that something would genuinely improve your life, accompanied by a motivation to pursue it. This is not inherently problematic. It is, in fact, the basic mechanism through which meaningful growth, contribution, and positive change occur in the world. A world without desire would be a world without art, without innovation, without the building of anything beyond bare survival. Attachment, as distinguished in contemplative psychology, is something different and more specific. It refers to a particular relationship with desire, in which your present sense of okayness becomes contingent on the desired outcome actually occurring. With attachment, the wanting is no longer simply a forward-oriented motivation. It becomes a condition placed on present peace, an implicit contract stating that contentment will only be permitted once this particular thing has been obtained. This distinction explains a pattern many people have noticed in their own experience without having clear language for it. Two people can want the exact same thing, a promotion, a relationship, a financial milestone, and experience entirely different relationships to that wanting. One person pursues the goal with genuine energy and engagement, while remaining essentially at peace regardless of the outcome, because their well-being was never actually staked on the result. The other person pursues an identical goal while experiencing significant anxiety, irritability, and a kind of low-grade suffering throughout the pursuit, because their sense of basic okayness has been entirely mortgaged to an outcome that has not yet occurred and may never occur exactly as imagined. The first person is experiencing desire without attachment. The second is experiencing what contemplative traditions and increasingly contemporary clinical psychology identify as the actual source of suffering, not desire itself, but the specific decision, often made unconsciously, to place present peace in escrow, pending a future outcome outside of full personal control. Acceptance and commitment therapy, a well-researched and empirically validated approach developed by psychologist Stephen Hayes, offers a particularly useful and practical framework here. A CT distinguishes clearly between pursuing values, which the approach treats as healthy, sustainable, and genuinely important, and pursuing specific outcomes as a precondition for psychological well-being, which tends to produce exactly the kind of chronic dissatisfaction this book has been examining since Chapter 1. A value in this framework is a chosen direction, something like wanting to contribute meaningfully through your work, or wanting to build a loving family that can be lived out and honored in the present moment through your current actions, regardless of whether some specific future milestone has yet been reached. An outcome, by contrast, is a specific, measurable target, a particular job title, a particular income level, a particular relationship status that either has or has not been achieved at any given moment, with no available middle ground. Hayes and his colleagues have found, across substantial clinical research, that psychological flexibility, the capacity to pursue meaningful values without rigidly attaching present well-being to specific outcomes, correlates strongly with lower rates of anxiety and depression and with greater overall life satisfaction, even among people facing genuinely difficult circumstances. This research provides strong empirical support for what contemplative traditions have taught for centuries through different language. The suffering does not come from wanting good things. It comes from the specific belief, rarely examined consciously, that you cannot be okay until the wanted thing actually arrives. There is a practical and immediately usable way to apply this distinction in your own life, one worth practicing directly. When you notice a strong pull towards something you currently lack, pause and ask a specific and clarifying question. Am I currently treating my peace as contingent on getting this? Often, simply asking the question honestly reveals the answer immediately, because the contingency, once named directly, becomes obviously visible in a way it was not while operating silently in the background. Having identified the contingency, the next step is not to abandon the desire, but to consciously separate it from the condition you had quietly attached to it. You can continue wanting the promotion, continue working toward it with genuine effort and energy, while consciously releasing the implicit agreement that your okayness depends on receiving it. This is, admittedly, easier to describe than to fully embody, and it is not a one-time decision that permanently resolves the pattern. It is a practice returned to repeatedly, particularly in moments when the old pattern of attachment reasserts itself, which it reliably will, especially for goals that connect to the deeper wounds discussed in Chapter 5. But the repeated practice of this separation between genuine desire and the unconscious contract of attachment is precisely what allows the rest of this book's central claim to become livable in practice rather than remaining merely an attractive idea. You can build, grow, achieve, and genuinely want more, while simultaneously residing, even now, in a present moment that is already, by its own measure, sufficient. This is wanting without suffering, not the absence of desire, but desire finally relieved of the impossible job it was never actually equipped to do, the job of producing your peace. Chapter 11. Enough in relationships, work, and money. The previous chapter established the distinction between desire and attachment, the foundation that allows genuine wanting to coexist with genuine peace. This chapter takes that foundation and applies it directly to the three domains where the hunger for more most reliably and most painfully manifests: relationships, work, and money. These are not arbitrary categories. Research on life satisfaction consistently identifies these three areas as the domains where people report the most persistent dissatisfaction. And not coincidentally, the three domains most heavily targeted by the comparison machinery described in Chapter 2. Begin with relationships, because the pattern here is particularly important and particularly subtle. Many people carry, often without fully realizing it, a quiet and persistent sense that their current relationship, however genuinely good, is somehow not quite enough. This frequently shows up not as a desire to leave the relationship, but as a chronic, low-grade dissatisfaction, a sense that something is missing, that a partner should be more attentive, more affectionate, more aligned, more impressive in some particular way. Esther Perel, whose extensive clinical work with couples has been widely studied, has written about how modern relationships are often burdened with an unprecedented psychological weight. We now frequently expect a single partner to provide what entire communities once provided collectively: stability, excitement, friendship, intellectual partnership, sexual fulfillment, and a continuously evolving sense of personal growth. This expectation, largely a product of the same cultural and comparison forces discussed in Chapter 2, sets relationships up for a particular and almost inevitable form of disappointment. Since no single human being can realistically fulfill every category of need a person might have. Applying the enough principle to relationships does not mean lowering your standards or tolerating genuine mistreatment. It means distinguishing clearly between two very different questions. Is this relationship genuinely healthy and sufficient for a good life? And does this relationship match an idealized, frequently comparison-driven fantasy of what a relationship should look like? The first question deserves honest and rigorous attention. The second question, pursued relentlessly, guarantees dissatisfaction regardless of how good the actual relationship is. Because the idealized fantasy, like the moving finish line of Chapter 1, has no fixed endpoint against which any real relationship could ever be measured as sufficient. A useful practice here, drawn from research on relationship satisfaction, involves a deliberate shift from what researchers call deficit attention to what might be called sufficiency attention. Rather than scanning the relationship primarily for what is missing or inadequate. This practice involves regularly and deliberately noticing what is genuinely present and functioning. A partner's specific, ordinary acts of care, the particular quality of safety or humor or companionship the relationship actually provides. This is not about ignoring genuine problems that deserve direct attention. It is about ensuring that attention is not, by chronic default, oriented exclusively toward deficit, since that default orientation will, as established in Chapter 9, reliably generate a felt sense of insufficiency regardless of the relationship's actual quality. Work presents a related but distinct version of this pattern. Chapter 3 described the physiological cost of chronic dissatisfaction, and work is frequently where that cost accumulates most severely, given the sheer number of hours most people spend engaged in it. The relevant comparison here is rarely your work measured against some absolute standard, but your career measured against the careers of peers, particularly peers visible through social media or professional networking platforms, whose displayed accomplishments, as Chapter 6 demonstrated, represent carefully curated highlights rather than full and accurate pictures of their actual professional experience. Applying enough to work involves a specific reframe worth holding consciously. Rather than asking only whether your career has reached some predetermined milestone, ask additionally whether your work currently provides what genuinely matters to you. Whether that is a sense of contribution, adequate compensation for your needs, reasonable autonomy, or meaningful relationships with colleagues. This is not a call to abandon professional ambition. It is, consistent with Chapter 10's distinction, a call to pursue professional growth as a genuine value rather than as a desperate attempt to close a gap that no specific achievement has ever permanently closed for you before. Money deserves particular attention, because it is perhaps the domain where the abstract principles of this book meet the most direct resistance. Research conducted by Daniel Kahneman and Angus Deaton, examining the relationship between income and well-being, produced findings that remain widely cited and frequently misunderstood. Their research found that emotional well-being does increase with income, but only up to a certain point, beyond which additional income produces diminishing and eventually negligible returns in day-to-day emotional experience. Even though a separate measure, overall life evaluation, continued to rise somewhat further. The specific dollar figure identified in their original research has been debated and refined by later studies, but the core finding has held up reasonably well across subsequent research. Beyond a level of income sufficient to meet genuine needs and provide reasonable security, additional money does considerably less for emotional well-being than most people. Operating under the assumptions discussed throughout this book tend to expect. This does not mean money is unimportant. Genuine financial security matters enormously, and this book has been careful throughout to distinguish enough from the conditions of genuine scarcity, where real material need exists. What the research suggests is something more specific and, for many readers, genuinely useful to know clearly. Once basic security and a reasonable margin above it have been achieved, the continued pursuit of additional income, driven by the comparison and scarcity mechanisms discussed in earlier chapters, frequently produces far less actual improvement in daily well-being than the pursuit itself assumes, while often extracting a genuine cost in time, stress, and attention that could otherwise be directed toward relationships, health, or meaningful contribution. A practical application here involves periodically and honestly examining your own financial goals, asking specifically what level of income or savings would represent genuine sufficiency, distinct from an open-ended and unexamined commitment to simply earning more indefinitely. Many people, when they do this exercise carefully and honestly, discover that they have never actually defined what enough would look like financially. and have instead been operating on an implicit assumption that more is always automatically better. An assumption Chapter 1 demonstrated does not hold up against the actual research on adaptation and satisfaction. Across all three domains, relationships, work, and money, the underlying practice remains consistent with everything this book has established. Notice the deficit-oriented default. Deliberately redirect attention toward genuine, currently present sufficiency. Distinguish authentic desire for growth from anxious attachment to a specific outcome. And return to this practice repeatedly, not as a single decisive correction, but as an ongoing discipline applied in the actual, ordinary circumstances of your actual, ordinary life. Chapter 12. The Quiet Life. Every chapter in this book has been building deliberately and step by step toward this final question. What does a life actually look like when it is genuinely built on enough, rather than on the perpetual pursuit of more that Part 1 described so carefully? This is not an abstract or merely philosophical question. It has specific, observable, livable characteristics, and this chapter intends to describe them as concretely as possible. The first characteristic is a particular and somewhat counterintuitive relationship to ambition. Contrary to a concern that may have arisen earlier in this book, a life built on enough is not necessarily a life of reduced ambition or diminished achievement. Many people who have genuinely internalized the practices described in Part 4 continue to build significant careers, raise thriving families, and pursue substantial creative or professional goals. What changes is not the presence of ambition, but its underlying engine. Ambition driven by the scarcity mind described in Chapter 4, by the unresolved wounds described in Chapter 5, or by the comparison machinery described in Chapter 6, tends to be frantic, anxious, and curiously unsatisfying even when successful, precisely because it was never actually oriented toward the visible goal in the first place. Ambition arising from a foundation of genuine present sufficiency tends to feel different in its lived texture, more like genuine creative engagement and less like a desperate attempt to outrun an internal sense of inadequacy. The actions can look remarkably similar from the outside. The internal experience of taking them is substantially different. The second characteristic is a meaningfully altered relationship with time, building directly on the insight from Chapter 8. A life built on enough involves spending measurably more of its hours actually present within them, rather than mentally projected into an anticipated future or a remembered past. This produces what many people who have sustained these practices over time describe as a subjective lengthening of life, not in literal duration, but in the felt richness and memorability of ordinary days. Daniel Kahneman's research on what he termed the experiencing self versus the remembering self is relevant here. Much of modern life is organized around satisfying the remembering self, the part of you that will later recall and evaluate an experience, often at the expense of the experiencing self. The part of you actually present and undergoing the experience as it happens. A life built on enough tends to rebalance this, restoring genuine value to direct present experience rather than treating most moments as merely instrumental, useful only insofar as they eventually produce some satisfying memory or future outcome. The third characteristic involves relationships. and follows directly from Chapter 11's discussion of deficit attention versus sufficiency attention. People who have genuinely internalized the principle of enough tend to report relationships of notably higher quality, not because their relationships are objectively free of normal difficulty, but because chronic deficit scanning, the relentless and largely unconscious search for what a partner, friend, or family member is failing to provide, tends to diminish significantly. This creates space for what relationship researchers call appreciation, a documented and measurable contributor to relationship satisfaction and longevity, to operate with far less interference than it faces in relationships dominated by ongoing comparison and unmet, often unstated, expectation. The fourth characteristic is a different relationship to rest. This deserves particular attention because it is frequently the area where the old patterns described throughout this book reassert themselves most stubbornly. A nervous system shaped by chronic scarcity, as described in Chapter 4, often experiences genuine rest as somehow dangerous or irresponsible, generating subtle but persistent guilt during moments of leisure, relaxation, or simple, unproductive presence. A life genuinely built on enough involves a gradual and significant reduction in this guilt, allowing rest to be experienced not as a suspicious indulgence requiring justification, but as a legitimate and valuable part of a life that does not need to be continuously earning its own right to exist through perpetual productivity. The fifth and perhaps most important characteristic is durability under difficulty. This addresses directly a concern that arises naturally throughout this entire book. Is the peace described here fragile, dependent on circumstances remaining favorable, or genuinely robust enough to withstand real adversity? The research on psychological flexibility discussed in Chapter 10, along with extensive clinical research on contemplative practice, suggests something genuinely encouraging here. People who have practiced the disciplines described throughout Part 3 and Part 4, presence, gratitude, the conscious separation of desire from attachment, tend to demonstrate measurably greater resilience when genuine adversity does arrive. Not because they have somehow inoculated themselves against difficulty, but because their sense of basic okayness was never entirely contingent on favorable circumstances to begin with. When hardship comes, and it eventually comes to everyone, this foundation tends to bend without breaking, in a way that a contentment built entirely on accumulated external achievement, as described throughout Part 1, often cannot. It is worth being honest in this closing chapter about what this book has not promised. It has not promised a permanent, fully achieved state in which the old patterns of comparison, scarcity, and restless wanting never again arise. The evolutionary wiring described in Chapter 4 does not simply disappear through reading a book or practicing a few exercises for several weeks. The comparison machinery described in Chapter 2 continues operating every day with extraordinary sophistication on everyone who remains connected to it. What this book has offered, more modestly and more honestly, is a set of practices, repeatedly returned to, through which the old patterns gradually lose some of their previously unquestioned authority. The moving finish line continues to exist as a feature of human psychology, but you no longer have to mistake it for the actual location of your peace. A quiet life, in the sense this final chapter intends, is not necessarily a small life, or an unambitious one, or a life without significant achievement or contribution. It is a life lived increasingly from a foundation that does not require the next achievement, the next comparison won, the next milestone reached, in order to feel basically, currently, sufficiently okay. From that foundation, you remain entirely free to build, to grow, to want good things, and to pursue them with genuine energy. What changes, finally and most importantly, is simply this. You are no longer waiting for arrival in order to begin actually living the life that was, in its essential and most important sense, already sufficient long before you noticed. Closing, a letter to the still hungry. Dear listener, I want to speak to you directly for a moment, outside the structure of chapters and research and frameworks, because there is something important that gets lost if this book ends only with its final practical point. You may have finished these 12 chapters and still feel hungry. That is not a failure, neither yours nor this book's. It is simply what happens when an old pattern, built across years or decades and reinforced daily by forces this book described carefully in Part 1 and Part 2, meets a new understanding for the first time. The understanding does not erase the pattern instantly. It begins slowly and imperfectly to loosen its grip. If you are still hungry tonight, I want you to know something clearly. The hunger is not evidence that something is wrong with you. We open this book with that exact reassurance, and it deserves repeating now at the close, because it is easy to forget under the pressure of wanting to have already arrived somewhere better than where you currently stand. The hunger is evidence of a nervous system doing precisely what evolution built it to do, operating in a culture specifically engineered, as Chapter 2 described, to keep that ancient system perpetually activated for profit. You did not fail to outgrow this hunger through insufficient effort or insufficient virtue. You are simply a person living inside the specific historical moment this book has been describing throughout. What I am asking of you now is not perfection. It is not the permanent and complete resolution of every scarcity-driven impulse for the remainder of your life. What I am asking is smaller, and I believe genuinely more achievable. Tonight or tomorrow morning, find 3 minutes. Sit somewhere quiet. Notice your breath moving without your management of it. Notice one single thing in your actual present circumstances that is, right now, genuinely sufficient. Let your attention rest there slightly longer than feels natural, the way Chapter 9 described. That is the entire practice. 3 minutes. One sufficient thing. A slightly extended attention. Do this again tomorrow, and the day after that. Not because 3 minutes will dissolve years of conditioning, but because, as the research throughout this book has consistently shown, the mind that practices noticing sufficiency, even briefly, even imperfectly, gradually becomes a mind more capable of recognizing sufficiency when it is genuinely present. This is not mysticism. It is simply how trainable cognitive capacities reliably work, demonstrated across decades of careful research cited throughout these chapters. I want to leave you with one final thought, the one this entire book has ultimately been circling around from its very first page. The moving finish line described in Chapter 1 will likely never fully stop moving, not completely, not permanently, because it is built into a mind shaped by forces far older and far larger than any single person's individual effort to overcome them. But you do not need the finish line to stop moving in order to find peace. You need only to notice, more and more often, peace you have been running toward was never actually waiting at the line in the first place. It was here, in the noticing itself, in the breath you did not have to manage, in the present moment, available to you now, exactly as it is, sufficient. That is the peace of enough, not an achievement to be reached. A door, quietly available every single day, waiting only for your attention to finally turn toward it. Go gently with yourself tonight. You have already begun.